This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a collection of scholarly books about animal studies. Given the topic of today's interview, I'll mention one in particular, Animal Death, which was edited by Jay Johnson and Fiona Probyn-Rapsay, which was released in 2020. This book contains a number of chapters exploring animal death, including a paper on respect for the dead by Chloe Taylor, which I've personally found very useful, and a paper on veterinary euthanasia by Anne Fawcett. Also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Now today I'm very pleased to introduce you to an animal studies scholar who I have known for many years, and so whose appearance on Knowing Animals is long overdue. Dr. Angie Pepper is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Roehampton in the United Kingdom. She works in moral and political philosophy and has published papers on, among other topics, animals' rights to privacy, animals' political agency, and what we owe to animals in light of climate change. Today, we're going to talk about the collection The Ethics of Animal Shelters, which Angie co-edited with Valery, Giroux and Kristin Voigt, including both the guidelines and recommendations in part 1 of the book, and Angie's own chapter, Caring in Non-Ideal Conditions, Animal Rescue Organisations and Morally Justified Killing, which appears in part 2 of the book. And I should add that The Ethics of Animal Shelters was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Angie.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
Could you tell me a bit about how this book came about?
Yeah, so my colleagues, Valery, Giroux and Kristin Voigt, had been working with the Montreal SPCA, and they'd been having conversations with them about sort of some of the ethical challenges that shelter workers face in their everyday practice. And they'd realised that between them that actually there seemed to be a lot of scope for tackling these questions, and actually a lot of scope for philosophers to have something to say about the challenges that shelter workers face. So to cut a long story short, they put in a bid for funding and they received it from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada. And then the collaboration started, and I was invited to be a part of the team of philosophers who were going to sit down with shelter workers at the Montreal SPCA and get to the bottom of like what these ethical challenges were and have a think about how to kind of explain them and potentially respond to them, and maybe think, even if we couldn't give concrete responses, think of strategies for how you might address some of these challenges. So that was the sort of origins of the project. And so the book is the outcome of these conversations. And as you mentioned in your introduction, it has a first part in which we detail the problems that the shelter workers raised, and we kind of clarify those and set them out. And then we make some recommendations, and then we provide the justification for those recommendations. And then part 2 of the book just consists of a series of philosophical chapters which really go into more detail about those justifications. And so they give you a kind of more robust philosophical exploration and defense of some of the things that we're recommending.
I'm glad you mentioned talking to the staff of these shelters, because in the book's introduction, you mentioned that there was a practitioner-driven methodology, which is not something I've seen in a philosophy book before. Could you tell me about this?
Yeah, so it was important from the get-go that we did not impose upon shelter workers the kinds of moral problems that we anticipated they might experience. So what we did was we had 2 rounds of sitting down with members of staff at the shelter, so in the shelter environment, which I think was particularly important for us to get a sense of what it's like to be in that environment to get a sense of all of the noise and the sounds and the smells of being in that kind of in that context. So sitting down with the workers, the employees of the Montreal SPCA, and asking them, what are the things that you find most challenging in your day-to-day work? And through this kind of very loose, sort of open questioning, we got a sense of what the problems were that they faced, but also what their commitments were. So I think this has also been very important to the project, that it's not just that the problems that we address in the volume are the problems that the staff themselves identified, but also that the framework with which we try to address those challenges is also a framework which has its roots in the Montreal SPCA's very own policies, right, and its very own mission statement and the commitments of the staff themselves. At least in that sense, we took quite a hands-off approach, right, to trying to figure out what exactly the problems were and like how we should go about addressing the challenges, but rather really just listening to what we were being told and taking it from there. So it's much more a work of practical philosophy in that sense, that it starts from the bottom up as opposed to applying a theory, trying to apply a theory on top of things that you're seeing.
So I realise we can't go through the whole of the recommendations and guidelines document, but how would you characterise the recommendations that you're offering?
So I think that they cover a really wide range of challenges. Some of the challenges are to do with the treatment of individual animals who are rescued. Some of them are more organisational. Some of them are to do with potential conflict and disagreement amongst staff. Some of them are to do with how the organisation ought to orient itself towards the wider society and the wider political institutions in which it finds itself. And so, given that there's multiple levels, right, in which the organisation finds itself having these challenges, and so the recommendations really are covering a wide range of things, including, for example, what the diet should be for shelter animals. Should shelter animals be fed only a plant-based diet? What kind of language should the shelter use to talk about animals, particularly abandoning the terminology of pets, or making sure that we're not talking about animals as though they're property, particularly for farmed animals. There are questions to do with adoption policy, so how stringent should adoption policy be? There are questions to do with, as I mentioned, like how you should resolve disagreement, or how should we go about decision making. So one of the things that we recommend is establishing an ethics board. And I think that the recommendations do deal with a lot of issues to do with killing, as you mentioned. So it was an important theme that came up time and time again in our discussions with staff, not just the killing of potentially adoptable animals, but also abortions in late-term pregnancy, the question of like whether resources ought to be diverted to a palliative care program.
One of the things that struck me about the recommendations is that they're quite radical. One of the recurring recommendations you make is that the Montreal SPCA should foreground an opposition to all animal exploitation. How big a change would this be for animal shelters?
I think the one thing to say first is that shelters they're a very varied mix of organisations. So what we were able to say in this book speaks primarily to the Montreal SPCA and its position. And as I said, a lot of what we based the recommendations on were rooted in their mission statement and their existing policies. Not all organisations are going to be in a similar position socially, politically, financially, right, to take on all of what we have sort of suggested for the Montreal SPCA. So that's one thing, just to say that, right? And as we note in the introduction, the Montreal SPCA is a particularly progressive animal welfare organisation. It has had a particularly progressive recent history. And so that might not be the same for other organisations. But I think that one issue that this throws up is the SPCA or any sheltering organisation finds itself having to operate in a context in which animals are routinely exploited and routinely harmed, routinely killed. Now, how is it to orient itself towards the outside world when its survival is so dependent on donations? So very few organisations will have state funding. Very few organisations will have the kind of state funding needed to carry out all of the operations, like their everyday sheltering operations. So most of them will depend on donations. And in order to make sure that you keep getting those donations, right, you have to make sure that your public image is one in which people are going to donate to you. And so how to manage exactly your public image, given that, you know, the rest of the world out there might not be as progressive as you, I think is very difficult. And especially difficult for those organisations which have a law enforcement component. So like the RSPCA here in the UK, the Montreal SPCA has a branch that is dedicated to law enforcement. And that means that not only are you required to look into cases where, say, companion animals are being abused by their guardians or neglected, but also you have something to do with the agricultural industry. Now, how do you square this relationship with the agricultural industry with your core commitments, which are essentially against the exploitation of animals? So these are just like really tricky questions, and they're very, very difficult to answer. I'm not sure that we've really given answers that are completely satisfying, and I'm not sure that they're definitely not answers that are likely to stay the same, right, for a very long time, because shelters are always operating within a social and political context which is changing. So what might not be prudent now, right, which what might not be feasible now might become feasible in 10 years, say. I think that the one thing that we learn, or that the project taught us most, is that these are organisations which are operating in extremely non-ideal circumstances, who are trying to do what is right for some of, you know, our society's most vulnerable individuals. And they're very, very non-ideal circumstances because of the wider social attitudes towards animals in general.
I was going to ask something about a topic very close to my heart, which is the recommendation that shelters should feed animals plant-based diets. But I think this talk of non-ideal situations leads quite neatly to your chapter, which is about killing and death, and the fact that animal shelters will often kill animals under their care. What was it that led you to focus on the killing of animals in shelters?
Yeah, so I think one was probably happenstance. So at the time, I had been teaching a course on the ethics of killing. So I spent a lot of time reading philosophy about killing, what makes killing wrong, what makes death bad, all of these things. But also when we conducted the interviews with shelter staff, I think that it was so clear to me that this issue is so emotionally troubling and so stressful and so psychologically burdensome for the workers that it felt like, you know, something I needed to do something, right, to contribute to this area, to try to alleviate this psychological weight, right, of this feeling of, you know, just being stuck in a tragic situation in which you have all of these animals that need to be saved, but not all of the resources that you need to save them. And so that was really what was driving me. I think that I have never worked in an animal shelter, so I, you know, did not really know that much about the nature of these kinds of choices, the attachment that workers will form with particular animals, the really, really highly stressful circumstances of being contained and confined within a shelter, which has a really bad impact on the mental well-being of the animals themselves. So there's lots of things that the more that you know about the context, the easier or the clearer it becomes to see that actually, like, this is a really tragic predicament. And I think that, you know, animal ethicists should have something to say about this.
You say that the problem you're addressing is a tragic situation that arises only if we assume that animals have both a right not to be killed and a right to be rescued. Could you introduce us to this?
Yeah, so I think that if animals didn't have a right not to be killed, right, there would be no problem with, killing a few animals to make room for some more animals in the animal shelter. So it seems to me that in order for this kind of tragic situation to get going, we have to think, no, animals do have a right against being prematurely killed. So they have a right against being killed for non-euthanasia reasons. But it also needs to be the case that they have a right to rescue, because otherwise we could just let them go, right? So why kill them? Why not just let them take their chances on the street? And there, I think it's a bit more controversial policy-wise, because I think that for some people, actually, that is the thing that we should do. We should release them to fend for themselves. But for animals that do not have the capacity to care for themselves on the street, you're really just exposing them to a great deal of risk. How are they going to feed themselves? How are they going to find access to clean drinking water? How are they going to avoid all of the hazards that come from like urban life? And if you release them to somewhere more rural, then they probably won't last 5 minutes against the other animals that are out there. So I think that once we acknowledge that animals do have this right not to be killed and a right to be rescued, that's when this tragic predicament gets going, right? Then we think, well, okay, we've got all of these animals. And as I mentioned, a lot of animal shelters, they're not resource rich, right? Most of them do not have the resources, especially the large open admission shelters. And so those are the ones that I'm interested in. Those shelters who have to take all of the animals that come to their door, they don't turn any animals away. How do they make decisions about which animals to save, given that it's morally wrong to turn them away and it's morally wrong to kill them?
You introduce a tripartite distinction between different acts of killing in shelters. What's that?
My basic thought is that in the ethics of killing, there is a tripartite distinction between three kinds of killing. So firstly, you can have morally justified killing, and that might be killing in cases of genuine euthanasia. And then you have other cases where it's justified, but it nonetheless infringes the right of the person who is killed. And so in the case of morally justified killing, you don't violate or infringe anybody's right if you give them a good death, for example, right? So if in the case of genuine euthanasia, there's no right violated or infringed. But in cases of morally justified killing, but where there's a rights infringement, you have a good justification to perform the act of killing, but the person who's killed didn't deserve that in any way. And so you infringe their right not to be killed. And because it's an infringement, they're wronged. And because they're wronged, right, that wrong stands in need of some kind of redress. So it might be that there should be some kind of compensation or apology, or not to the person who's died, but perhaps to their family, or some effort to make sure that that kind of wrong doesn't occur again. And then you have just straightforward, morally unjustified killing, where there's no justification for killing whatsoever, and it just plainly violates a person's right not to be killed. So you think about that tripartite distinction in the ethics of killing, and then my thought was in the chapter to sort of think about what this means in the context of animal shelters. And I think that what's important, there are a couple of things that are important. First, that actually a lot of cases of so-called genuine euthanasia in animal shelters are not genuine euthanasia. They're not done in the animal's best interest. But for want of more resources or more space or just a good home, right, that could have been avoided. So that's just one thing. But there are nonetheless plenty of cases of genuine euthanasia. If there's nothing that can be done for an animal, if their life is more suffering than it is joy, then you have a good justification for terminating their life. But I think that the more interesting case is the case of what I call in the chapter injustice dependent killing. So the reason why a lot of animals are killed in animal shelters is because of injustice. There is distributive injustice in our society, which means that shelters don't have enough resources to save the animals in need. To simplify the picture, the upshot of this view is that, yes, there is something that's wrong that occurs. An animal is wronged when they have their right not to be killed overridden. But the shelter worker in these circumstances may nonetheless have a justification for the killing. And that means that the shelter worker themselves is not the perpetrator of the wrong. Rather, the state is the perpetrator of the wrong because they are the source of this distributive injustice. And often as well, they're responsible for the kinds of legislation that we have in place protecting animals. So they're kind of responsible for the societal context in which animals are neglected and abused and perhaps bred irresponsibly and these kinds of things. But they're also responsible for not ensuring that shelters have enough resources to take care of all of the animals in need. And so what I'm trying to do with this tripartite distinction, this particular category, is show how, because it seems like there's a bit of a puzzle. We have these shelter workers who don't want to kill animals at all, and they're beside themselves with being forced into situations in which they don't have any choice. We feel clearly that there's something wrong happening, and we feel that a wrong is done to the animal. But at the same time, it seems that it's not fair to blame the shelter worker, but often as well, for many of the animals, a case can be made that it's in their best interest when, for example, the only option available is for them to be in confinement in a really stressful shelter for months on end without any possibility of being rehomed and then become psychologically traumatized. So that's just one case, but there are sometimes good reasons for the animal themselves, but that are kind of combined with these other reasons to do with space and the need to save many more animals. And I think that all of this is just what it suggests to me is that in these cases, the shelter workers seem to do what's morally required. Right? You've got to make a decision about who you're going to save. You've tried all other avenues. You need to make a decision now. You can't wait for the circumstances to change. And so what should you do? And it might be that in a particular instance, you make the decision to kill these 2 to save these 15. You're justified in doing that because you're going to save these 15, right? That's the justification. It's a lesser evil. You're faced with all bad options, and the least bad of those options is to save the 15 and not the 2, say. And so the shelter worker in these circumstances does something right by killing the animals in order to save others, but nonetheless the animal is wronged. And I think that really it's trying to give us an account of where's the wrong coming from? Who's wronging the animals? That's what kind of led me to this thought that actually it's the wider context and the main agent being the state who is responsible for the distributive injustice which leads to these circumstances. I think one last thing is just that the account captures as well, I think, the remorse, the regret, the feelings of guilt that shelter workers experience. And it at least can say that makes sense, right? Given that you're in such close causal proximity to a wrong. So when you are killing animals that you know, for want of more time, more resources, more space, could have been rehomed, of course, it's an appropriate response to the fact that a wrong is being done. But all I'm saying is that the wrong doesn't lie typically with the shelter workers. It lies with the state and, to some extent, all of us, because we're responsible for the political institutions under which we live our lives.
I think some people might be really quite troubled to hear you defending this kind of killing. You've already responded to the challenge that some people might make, saying that we should release these animals rather than killing them, and that's not a view that you accept. But let me offer another worry. You present 2 kinds of cases when it is, in your view, acceptable for shelters to kill animals as a case of injustice-dependent killing. One is the case in which an animal could live a good life, but that seems unlikely given the current institutional setup. You call that a better off dead case. And another is a case when an animal is killed for the sake of others. You call that a sacrificial killing case. We'd be troubled to hear of humans being treated in these ways. We'd think that disrespected their rights. So why should we allow or endorse animals being treated in that way?
I actually think that we'd only be kind of surprised or upset to hear of humans being treated in this way against the backdrop of a relatively good healthcare system, right? But that's not the situation that shelter workers face. What they face is something much more akin to like disaster, right? So some kind of really awful environmental disaster where you have to make decisions very fast in order to save human lives. And there's lots and lots of injured or ill people that you have to choose between. And so when you have these kinds of disasters, then in a human case, you'll have triage protocols in place. And that's really what's going on in the shelter context. And so when we have triage protocols in place in the human setting, right, some people just will lose out, right? Unfortunately, we have to make decisions about who to save when we can't save everybody. And that is exactly the situation that they're facing. So I agree that no animal should be killed in an animal shelter. Like that, it's just morally wrong, and it is a symptom of the institutional and distributive injustice that we face. And the way to rectify that, of course, is to properly fund shelters, and they should be funded by the state and not dependent on donation. And we should be paying for that, right? We should be paying to ensure that all animals have somewhere, right, where they can be rescued if they are in need. So, yeah, it's not that I'm all for killing animals or killing humans, but there are some contexts in which we actually just don't have a choice. They're tragic choice situations. And just as our rights are stringent, and they should safeguard us against being sacrificed or killed unjustifiably, as the kind of better off dead cases I mentioned in the book, where it's sort of in your interest, but only because there aren't enough resources to go around. Like, we can agree that people shouldn't be killed in those contexts, but that is not the situation on the ground for people who work in animal shelters. And given that, and that's what I said earlier about it being an incredibly non-ideal context, it calls for special measures, right? You can't expect people to be able to meet the demands of moral perfection when they're so badly constrained by distributive injustice.
Let me end on a more positive or perhaps more proactive note before turning to the regular questions. You said that this injustice lies with the state and to a certain extent all of us. What can we do to get shelter workers out of this tragic situation?
So, I think that there are many things that we could do just in terms of offering our time to shelters. And I think that this is a bit complicated because if you're inundated with like volunteers, then it becomes like hard to manage. But I think that like really there needs to be political change. I think that a lot of people believe that organisations like the RSPCA are funded by the state. They're just not. And so I guess that one thing that we might try to do is to get this on the political agenda by emailing our MPs or writing to our local government representatives and asking them, like, is there any chance of raising this issue, given how much work these organisations do? Shouldn't this be something which is state funded, especially when it comes to those organisations which are also involved in law enforcement, since they're, doing the bidding of the state? You would think that there would be more money for them to do so. So there's that. I think that, maybe we'll come back to this in a minute. One thing that we might do is start to really question our practices of keeping pets in general. And we might start to wonder about what kind of society we want to live in the future. Is it a society which has the room for all of these animals? Because obviously the sort of negative side of pet keeping is that you have many more animals in need of rescue. And then we have many more animals who are vulnerable, and many more animals for these already overburdened organisations to try to save. And so I think that there are, personal questions that we might ask ourselves about whether we're involved in, perpetuating, but also kind of increasing the demand for animal companions and all of the stuff that comes with it in ways which are potentially problematic in this context and others further down the line.
Now, Angie, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I was racking my brains in anticipation of this question, and I think the answer is I was quite late to the party. So I didn't really start working on animal stuff until I was like 30 years old. So I think that my first interaction with animal rights stuff, or the kind of animal studies, was probably Peter Singer doing like first year undergraduate teaching or something like that. But I can't really remember it. But what I will say is that when I suddenly started to get really anxious about my PhD and the direction of it, and I realized that it was just terribly anthropocentric and that I'd kind of gone wrong just as I was like submitting it, I found a book in a secondhand bookshop called Environmental Philosophy from Animal Rights to Radical Ecology, I think. And it was an edited collection, edited by Michael Zimmerman, J. Babe Callicott, Karen Warren, and John Clark. And so this book was like probably my first introduction into animal studies, and it had like loads of great papers in there by Reagan and Singer and other people, and I found it really, really useful. It completely opened my eyes, and I think that one of the things that was good, it was a good first read, was that it was really wide ranging, right? So there was some really radical stuff in there, the kind of like ecofeminism stuff, and then some like basic animal rights stuff, and it was a great book. So that's my answer in a nutshell.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, so after I'd had this meltdown about my PhD and realised that it was terribly anthropocentric, I then wrote a paper called Beyond Anthropocentrism, Cosmopolitanism and Non-Human Animals. And just in a nutshell, my PhD dissertation had been on feminism and global justice, and I was interested in different ways of thinking about global justice. So how should we think about our relationship to other people in the world? And then at the end, I was like, oh no, why have I only been talking about humans this whole time? Like, why should I think that it's only humans who are owed duties of global justice, who have entitlements of global justice? And so the paper was an attempt to try to show everybody who I'd been like interacting with during the writing of my PhD that they were all wrong, that like the scope was too narrow, that if you wanted to be a cosmopolitan about global justice and you wanted to include all individuals globally into the scope of justice, then you had to include non-human animals too.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
This is like a really tricky question. I think that I feel like probably the answer is twofold. So I have been quite heavily influenced by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's work in general. And for a while, I was really taken with the Zoopolis model of political theory. But before I read Zoopolis, I actually read Gary Francione. His work has been much more at the forefront of my mind lately. And so I feel like these two camps have been kind of at war in my mind for the last, I guess, getting on for 10 years. And so they probably both had the most influence, I guess, on shaping like what I've been up to whilst I've been writing on these questions.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So I'm going to speak as a philosopher. I think that the most important thing that we can do is keep pushing animals onto the research agenda of most philosophers, right? Most subfields in philosophy. It strikes me as strange that Animals are so kind of present in our lives, in our homes, all around us. They're so much a kind of a part of the fabric of our practical lives, but yet in our theoretical lives, they're really marginal. So I think that it's important that we keep raising questions all the time in dominant strands of whether it be political philosophy or moral philosophy or even epistemology or philosophy of mind, trying to constantly put animals on the agenda and asking questions about them and about our treatment of them and about what they're owed. And I think that this is important because we need to know more, right? If we're to think about how to go about fixing the situation that we find ourselves in.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
This probably will come as no surprise given my earlier remarks, but I think increasingly I wish that we just didn't have such a desire to have them, to want them, even when we love them, to kind of want to possess them, to have control over them. I mean, we want to possess and control other humans, so it's not, a unique problem when we think about the animals in our lives. But I think that their vulnerability and their dependence upon us is there's an increasing source of concern for me. And I think that this brute desire that we have, right, the desire to touch them, to stroke them, to hold them, to confine them, like all of those things, I just wish that we were more measured in our desire for them. It would be better if we desired to look at them from afar, but perhaps not to have them so close to us in our grips.
What are you working on next?
A lot more of this, really. So the politics of domestication and the politics of pet keeping in particular. So thinking about this relationship that obtains between us and our animal companions, and really asking the question of whether there's something kind of constitutively wrong with the asymmetry in power, vulnerability and dependency.
How can people find out more about your work?
Probably easiest to just Google me, so Angie Pepper, and then philosophy, and then you'll find me.
Well, thanks so much, Angie, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great fun.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or on Facebook, and we're at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at Josh L. Milburn, or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. I'm also on Blue Sky, so seek me out there and we can connect. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.